turn it over to you to introduce the panel and take us through this guided conversation.
Great. Thanks for having me, and thanks to Carlo and team at the New North American Initiative for hosting this discussion. The previous panel talked a lot about the need to empathize with the ideas and priorities of the jurisdictions with whom we're engaged. I think it's fair to say that we've not done a good job at that collectively with respect to big intellectual and political changes occurring in the United States, and it speaks well of Carlo and the team, the New North American Initiative that we brought together. This panel, I think, to help understand some of those trends, what it means for America's place in the world, and of course, ultimately, what it means for Canada. Today's panel, of course, is part of this broader conversation about the Indo-Pacific. If you'll permit me, I'm thinking of our conversation in two parts. First of all, we'll interrogate and scrutinize some of the impulses and intellectual and political developments around what one might characterize as America First, but I think more broadly describes it, changes in the way America is thinking about its relationship to the world and thinking about its economic and security needs and priorities. In the second half, we'll take that conversation and apply it to the Indo-Pacific as something of a case study. And we are so lucky to have three people who are well placed to help us work through those big questions. Frederick, Fleitz, Matt Turpin, and Stephen Yates have extensive experience in the world of policy research, policy thinking, and think tanks, the White House, Congress, and elsewhere. And the three all bring a unique perspective on some of these big currents manifesting themselves in the Trump administration's policy agenda. But I think, as we'll get into today, ideas that ultimately transcend the administration and are likely to shape American economic and foreign policy for the years and possibly decades to come. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I thought, if you'll permit me, I would open with a broad question and give each of you a chance to engage it. For those of us who've grown accustomed to American foreign policy as it's manifests itself, say, over the past several decades, how do you think about it, and how do you think about the changes of which you are a part? How should we think about America First? I hate using that phrase, but as a shorthand for how the administration and policy experts in D.C. more generally are thinking about a new American poise to the world. Steve, why don't I start with you?
Well, thank you very much. This, frankly, is a topic we could take a whole hour, part of a day, and probably would not be sufficient because there's a lot behind it. I'll try to be economical, and I'll share with you kind of how I think, and friends are perfectly welcome to revise, extend, or correct. First and foremost, there's a tremendous tendency when people are analyzing the United States and the world to look at personalities more than actions. If you happen to be someone who is virulently triggered by a personality, sometimes that makes it incredibly difficult, to the point of impossibility, for you to see through to what are the real actions being taken, what are the real adjustments that are happening, and could those adjustments have been produced by actors other than the personality that takes all of the electricity off the grid. I think you might know who I'm talking about with regard to this personality, because Donald Trump is a force of nature that is very, very different, and he forces reactions that are very, very different. And in some cases, I think it forces people to forget or look past or maybe just ignore other drivers that are in the international system. First and foremost, I was a chairman for the state of Idaho and a member of the Republican National Committee in 2016 when both national conventions for the United States of America, the Democrats and Republicans, had signs with lines through the three letters TPP. That was not something that the parties themselves really had prepared to do. That was a populist and insurgent movement in both major parties that was organized around that kind of an issue. We hadn't really seen that since the NAFTA controversy from earlier. This was bigger, and this was more generic and grassroots up. And so something was clearly changing. Did Donald Trump make that so? I would argue no. Did he align with some of those forces behind that shift? I would say indisputably yes. And so there was one wave of change that was coming, coincident with Donald Trump, in agreement with a lot of things he talked about for a long time, like we should have fair deals and we should have better deals for America. It's a concise way of talking. It leaves a lot to be sorted out. But I think that ethos has informed a lot of what he has implemented, especially in earnest in his second term so far. And people can take of it what they may. The other significant changes that are out there that I think get underappreciated are some of the things that have to do with global institutions. There's a term, globalism, that gets used. I will just, for sake of philosophy 101 definition of terms, beginning of conversation, I'll just say this is the phenomenon where sovereign states, together with allies, but maybe just overall, we will subsume some of our sovereign prerogatives in order to invest in global rules, norms, and institutions on the bargain that by doing so, those institutions will normalize the outliers more than they will force us to having compromised for having joined. And there are a series of those where the experience from, I'd say, 2000 to the present is particularly unpleasant with regard to one big country that was the focus of the opening remarks. The World Trade Organization welcomed the People's Republic of China in 2000. It was formalized in 2001. And you'd have to ask yourself, over 25 years, has the dispute resolution mechanism served to enhance the general move towards lower barriers to trade and greater economic freedom inside China and otherwise? And you can judge that answer for yourself, but I would argue that the World Trade Organization has suffered under this tenure because the normative effect of the institution was not as big as was hoped for or promised. And so there's tension in that. The World Health Organization weathered basically a nuclear level event with the COVID pandemic. It struggled to get truth from the source, undisputed source country for the outbreak. And lest this again be bad orange man talking, there was a country that isn't front and center in everyone's mind in the Indo-Pacific conversation, but Italy. In the north of Italy, almost the entire textile industry had been overtaken by migrant work from China. And you can have your own imaginations of how that creates a certain kind of dialogue or disruptive narrative. But what came with that was that northern Italy was pulverized by the COVID pandemic at the very beginning because domestic travel was restricted inside of China, but international travel was left open without telling the truth about the virus, how to mitigate it, or what have you. And Italy was pulverized by that. What lesson do you draw from the role of a global institution in being able to moderate and resolve issues in an international system if you have significant case studies where we're not talking about a few people getting hurt, we're talking about trillions of dollars taken out of the global economy and millions of people dead, and many other lives disrupted, entire societies slowing down and degrading their approach to education for 1, in some cases 2 years, that is at least a cost that is greater than zero. And to hear talk of, well then, if you've experienced that, what are the adjustments that you would think are necessary? This isn't about whether you like or dislike a people or a country. If I am just in my household and in my neighborhood, things like this are happening, rational actors would say, actually, in caring about you, I want you to be able to mitigate these problems in your own household and in your own neighborhood, and you need to be transparent and accountable about it before I can have your children freely coming over for play dates and potentially spreading a virus that takes us out of work and school for a substantial period of time. So that happened. we have to remember that that happened, not to just scratch a wound, but we have to at least take a real life feedback for this. And a lot of this was happening after the bad orange man was out of office in the first term. And there were other things that increased. There's also the fentanyl pandemic that has hit the United States. I speak as a fentanyl father. My daughter was killed 2 years ago by this additive to a mood management pill that was sold off market. So she was killed by a Xanax pill. And so for 10 years, we've had one country in the world producing nearly all of the chemical precursors, which is like saying they didn't sell the gun, but they put the active bullet in the chamber. And for 10 years, they said, America, you have an addiction and drug problem, and we can't control this. Or they agreed to control it, and it didn't stop. And during the Biden administration, we had 300,000 fatalities. So I ask you, if the equivalent of 300,000 18 to 35-year-olds in China were killed because America had irresponsibly added something to food or other exports that went to China, what would the posture of their country, their policy leaders be about what does this mean about the kind of country that we have a relationship with? Does it mean full decoupling, some kind of going to war? I kind of feel like we've been on the receiving end of a chemical and biological war already. It might be low grade to some people's estimation, but at least by irresponsibility, if not by intent, something damaging has been done. It can't be overlooked, and for the sake of my daughter, I won't overlook it. But aside from it being personal, I think also personally we have to be mature enough to acknowledge. I was a part of the Bush administration. I was a part of the 1990s conservative movement that advocated for free trade, that advocated for the advent of the World Trade Organization, that advocated for normalizing trade relations with China. I am a student of classical Chinese. I speak Chinese. I've been to the culture many, many times. And I still feel like even if this was a member of my own family, you cannot ignore the consequences of systemic behavior that are disruptive economically and culturally. There are many, many other areas. I know that these gentlemen who are much more attractive and intelligent than I am will fill in some of those gaps, but I wanted to at least lay some of those things at the advent.
Yeah, well said. Now, I can't speak for everyone in the room, but I was nodding along for much of what you said, but you really focused your comments on China. And Frederick, the changes that we're seeing in American policy are not limited to China. They're extending more broadly, including, of course, for traditional allies like Canada. So bridging from what Steve just set out, even if the impetus for a lot of this rethinking is the U.S. relationship with China and the future of a bipolar or multipolar world, why have the changes extended more in America's relationships more broadly?
Well, I'm Fred Fleitz. I'm vice chair of the America First Policy Institute. I've had many jobs in my career, including working for Pete Hoekstra when he was on the House Intelligence Committee, and I had dinner with him last night. He wanted me to pass along his regrets that he could not come here today, but he did give me some pointers he wants me to raise. My organization has been talking about this America First approach to U.S. national security. We've been curating it and defending it between the Trump administrations, trying to explain what it is, prepare for a future administration, and it has pretty significant implications. I think it's better called the Trump Doctrine. It doesn't sound right to our friends in other countries. It sounds like isolationism or America alone, and Trump is obviously not an isolationist. This is an approach that calls for a strong American president, a competent foreign policy, a strong U.S. foreign policy team, the strongest possible U.S. military, but a president who will use military force prudently and keep us out of unnecessary wars, but will use military force when necessary. It also means standing with our friends and allies, but asking our allies to carry their own weight in their regions. It means that America makes its own foreign policy, where we will not be dictated to by the United Nations or by European elites. And I think it is a policy that's been quite successful in President Trump's first term in establishing American leadership. In the second term, it's been very successful. I think when we can see with the Gaza peace plan, they got all the live hostages out. I think we're seeing efforts by President Trump to end the war in Ukraine that have not succeeded yet. But there was no effort at all to end this war before Trump became president. And I think his effort, I think, will eventually yield fruit. But it's a difficult problem, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for attempting it. But President Trump's second term America First policy is different than the first term. It has direct implications for the Asia-Pacific. And we saw this when the president gave an important speech when he was in the Persian Gulf recently in Saudi Arabia, when he said that he wants America no longer to have permanent enemies. He does not want to pursue regime change. He wants peace through strength and commerce. And this is a message to Beijing and to Tehran and to Pyongyang. Make a deal with us to improve relations and we'll all grow rich. This is his approach as a businessman. He's trying to find a way to thread the needle for addressing security threats, but also trying to lower them with trade. And it's a different approach than we've seen with previous presidents. It obviously is not isolationism, and it is unfortunate that Iran did not take advantage of President Trump's offer to try to make a deal to stop its nuclear program. And let's make no mistake, their uranium enrichment program is a nuclear weapons program, and Trump knew that, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for not listening to the noise that the Iranians may be enriching to weapons grade, but they don't actually plan to make weapons. That's ridiculous. Trump didn't accept that. So it's unfortunate the Iranians didn't take advantage of what I think would have been a pretty lucrative deal to improve the lot of their people because it wants to make nuclear weapons. And I think Trump's decisiveness has played a significant role in promoting global security. And you can see how the world is looking for American leadership at the Sharm el-Sheikh summit after the 20-point peace plan was announced. All these nations who seem to be relieved that America is reasserting itself as a global leader after 4 years of indifference and confusion by Joe Biden, who made climate change our top national security challenge. Not Iran, not China, not terrorism, not nuclear proliferation. This made the world less safe, and Trump is countering that. I think we've seen in the Asia-Pacific the president revealing what his priorities and approaches will be. And frankly, we weren't sure of that until recently because I think he's been distracted by the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. The president is sticking by one of the best achievements of the Biden administration. That's the trilateral agreement between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan, not just to deal with the threat from North Korea, but to deal with the threat from China. He's sticking by the agreement, the AUKUS agreement, and the agreement to sell submarines to Australia. And there was debate within the administration on whether to do that. He's standing strongly with our Asia-Pacific allies. He's talked about the importance that we have to work together to counter the growing intelligence and military threat from China, a nation that is advancing its economy by stealing technology. And I really have to take issue with something by one of the previous panelists said, Mr. Zhang, which I thought his comments were excellent. But to say that China's human rights record is greatly improved is simply to say it has gone from extremely abysmal to abysmal. And to say that we should go to China to check out the human rights record, I don't think I'd be allowed to meet with the Uyghurs in China, who are currently being subject to elimination, to ethnic cleansing by the Chinese government, to pretend this isn't going on, to say that we don't have a moral obligation to speak out about what's being done to the Uyghurs and the people of Tibet, to argue that the people of China know what's going on when we know the censorship in China is so extreme that people in China do not know what's going on in these areas of the country. We do have a moral obligation to speak about that. I think human rights should be an element of our national security policy. And I think when we compare the U.S. and China and Canada, I'll say that Canada is America's best friend. And we know what Churchill said about democracies. It's the worst form of government, except for all the others who have tried from time to time. And each government occasionally is going to have a leader that the other one doesn't like. Certainly, many in the U.S. did not like Prime Minister Trudeau. But our friendship goes back 120, 200 years. We fought together. We have common values. And the idea, and Ambassador Hoekstra told me this, that there's actually some people in Canada who are saying that, well, the U.S. is unreliable, we don't like Trump, let's turn to China. That's crazy. We are your best friend. We will always be your best friend. We will resolve our differences, whatever they are right now. We know what our history is. I think we have to find a way to work with China, to encourage it to be a responsible international citizen. That's why Trump is being tough on trade, tough on security, but he also wants to engage the Xi government. He wants to go to Beijing. It's complicated. But I think it's the right approach. It is a more sophisticated approach to foreign policy than you are hearing in the American and Canadian media. I know very smart people who are working with the White House to get this right. And I've been advising them too, and I'm very optimistic on where American foreign policy is going.
We'll come back at the end to the subject of China more directly and how it relates to Canada. But Matt, I just want to give you a chance to weigh in on this bigger picture question. Fred called it the Trump doctrine. He focused a lot on the president himself. I think my sense, having spent some time with you in the past day or so, is that you think it's bigger than the president, and in some ways it's an unfinished project that you and others in these circles are litigating what the future of, again, imperfect as it is, what an America First foreign policy framework looks like.
Well, Sean, thanks so much for having us, and it's a real pleasure to be here in Ottawa. I think for us to sort of look at why and how U.S. policy has changed, first of all, it's multi-causal, right? What we have, is a series of events really since the end of the Cold War in which we had a perception of how we thought the world would work, sort of a normative system that we would be able to establish. We'd be able to sort of operate within a world in which there weren't great power rivalry, and that we could interact with one another through a set of rules and norms to be able to resolve our differences. And I think, we have largely awoken from our vacation from history to discover that in fact, the era of great power rivalry is alive and well. It's back with a vengeance, and we're going to have to sort of deal with those things. And that our faith in those international institutions, which are certainly established with the best intentions, are just not able to handle the real geopolitical challenges and geoeconomic challenges that we find ourselves in. And so I think as I look at sort of the causation of sort of where we are and what's kind of come up, I think we cannot underestimate sort of the impacts of sort of 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, on the perceptions of Americans of its role in the world and how it can act. I think, as a veteran of the Iraq War, there's a deep skepticism and a deep rejection of sort of a crusading aspect of changing the world and reforming it in our image. And I think so. You've got a whole portion of sort of the American electorate on both sides of the political spectrum that are very doubtful of those endeavors. To go hand in hand with that, right? So that's sort of the security side of what the United States have been doing in terms of providing sort of a global good of security.
Yes.
There's also a deep skepticism from the impacts of globalization, that the United States would essentially be the market of last resort. It would unilaterally drop barriers to trade, and then the rest of the world that would be able to sort of develop itself by selling into the U.S. market, and the U.S. would accept the costs of that. And I think what we've seen is a deep rejection of that across the communities in which that really manifested itself, right? Certainly not on Wall Street where others really benefited from that, and on the coasts, but in large swaths of America where that sort of writing off of your job is not worth it, somebody else can do that job. You have a number of American citizens that don't view that as a good bargain.
Yes.
And have become quite skeptical and reject that. And that's on both sides of the political spectrum, right? We see this manifesting on both sides. Steve pointed out sort of the bipartisan rejection of TPP, right? This is the dynamic that's happening. The third sort of aspect, or the third cause I would sort of point out, is this return of great power competition, this return of great power rivalry, right? I look back at and I encourage everyone to go back and read Robert Zoellick's famous September 2005. He was at the time the Deputy Secretary of State. What's commonly known as the responsible stakeholder speech, right, in which he calls on Beijing to fulfill its commitments on its entry into the WTO, right, 4 years after its entry, in which the United States government could already see that Beijing was not following through with its commitments, and he's sort of pleading with Beijing to act as a responsible stakeholder inside this system you have joined. And what we saw sort of proceeding from that over the next 2 decades was really, a Beijing that defines the United States as its principal adversary, and then pursues policies to undermine the United States at sort of every turn and to tear down that international order that had provided Beijing with such benefits. Largely because the Communist Party views that international order as a vector of sort of liberal thoughts that undermine its own position inside China. And then I think the last aspect that we're sort of in, and unfortunately, there's a degree of perception on the U.S. side of kind of an irresponsibility of U.S. allies, that they would view U.S. security guarantees as an obligation of the American taxpayer, that they themselves could cut their own defense spending. Not that would happen here, but I mean, I'll just say, like, a country like Germany that pursues essentially a disarmament policy while simultaneously making itself increasingly dependent upon its principal rival and adversary, right? And then when the United States asks for it to sort of resolve these things, there is a rejection that how dare you ask us to do these things, even though we're in an alliance, and the expectation is an alliance that there is shared responsibility all around. It is not the United States' sole responsibility to take care of everyone and provide all of the benefits. And I think those combinations of things has sort of led Americans, again, on both sides of the political spectrum, to desire a change in the way that comes. And that is not, and I completely agree, that is not isolationism and an abandonment of the world. It's a reshaping of that international order to better serve our interests and to better serve the interests of countries that we identify with and think that we have friendly relations with, but we need them to also act responsibly in this system.
Yeah, that's a great, I think a great level setting in terms of the ideas and impulses that are behind some of the changes we're seeing that, of course, are manifesting themselves in growing demands on allies and a rebalancing of our economic arrangements and of course, security expectations of allies like Canada. This, of course, is the Indo-Pacific Strategy Forum, so I think we ought to spend the remainder of the conversation on that particular subject. Steve, you set out some different scenarios for how the future of the U.S.-China relationship might look. Just elaborate a bit. How are people in and around the administration and the kind of broader intellectual movement around conservative foreign policy thinking, how is it grappling with those different scenarios and what it means for America?
Well, I had the opportunity to travel with Secretary Hegseth to go from North Asia down to Southeast Asia, the ASEAN meetings in Kuala Lumpur. One of the great advantages of going to those kinds of things is you have many, many bilateral and multilateral gatherings. A lot of what I see myself from watching through what the team is doing in action, but also just having watched this space from all of my adult life for the better part of it. We have gone from naming things in different ways, but the biggest strategic change really began in the late Clinton and early Bush administration when we acknowledged the now most populous country on the planet is actually part of Asia in India. And it was the NSC and the first Bush White House that included South Asia in its Asia Directorate as opposed to being grouped together with its Middle East Directorate. And that was sort of the beginning of trying to look at how do we try to define the space for a region, and these are imperfect and imprecise things. And so we are in an Indo-Pacific forum. It could have been called an Asia-Pacific forum. The map I had in my White House office had Asia by the National Geographic going all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And so this is how we slice the pie. And this seems like a distraction, but it really is the core of how you're going to think about the various players. You begin with, well, who's inside the fence and who's outside the fence? And what I saw in action very much was, again, just reinforcing what's already been said, pretty intense and robust engagement with allies and partners. When the president was at ASEAN, and I would note, President Trump went to ASEAN. Not every American president goes to that forum. And when going to that forum, they had multiple meetings. There's the Quad meeting that gathered there that is U.S., Australia, Japan, and India. There's another Quad that also met there that is the U.S., Japan, the Philippines, and Australia. There is the informal that is the gathering itself and its dialogue partners, and the U.S. is meeting with all of the ASEAN members themselves directly in pretty open Q&A, some of it open to the press, some of it not. But in every one of these conversations, it is not the United States that is entering the room to say we would like to change sovereign boundaries. It is not the United States stepping into the room to say we'd like to alter the fundamentals of freedom of navigation on the high seas. It's not the United States that's saying we would like to have more illegal fishing and informal vessels crashing into Coast Guard vessels. And it's not the United States that decided that the Philippines wanted to rev up and defend itself more. In fact, the United States, for multiple administrations, had memo exercises suggesting that we improve and enhance the alliance with the Philippines, and it would fall a bit after the meetings. And they had a president that was very forward-leaning about engagement in economic opportunity with China first. And what really mugged them back to reality was not the United States. It was an external factor in that. And so what does it mean for the United States? The United States enters the room, in this instance, maybe contrary to what might be the perception in media or other conversations. It's not telling the region, this is what you must do. It's saying, this is what the region has said they want done. And the underlying, I think, deeper thought in all of the regions that the administration has been touching is that the dominant regional players, especially from our point of view, those that are allied with us, ought to play the leading role in saying what the objectives are, and they ought to play a fair and perhaps leading role in resourcing what should be done about meeting that objective. But under those circumstances, the United States very much will be present and will aim to be a decisive factor, tipping it in our favor. Now, that could sound selfish, but that's what we expect every country to do. Including those that disagree with us and those who want to be hostile to us, to enter the room and try to tip it in their favor. But so I think when I see the options that are going forward, I see a U.S.-Japan alliance that has frankly never been better. And I've watched it for over 35 years. And we've had good times, but the Prime Minister Takaichi is a tremendous opportunity for this administration to solidify some gains, and that matters because Japan really is a responsible stakeholder. It really is a willing contributor to others that want to make sure that their territorial claims are honored, that there are meaningful, safe merchant marine activities going on in the region of the world that is responsible for no less than 50% of all global container traffic. And so this is not sort of a personality contest. And so when I see these adjustments, I see things that are ally-led, and we want these alliances rebalanced in a way that is sustainable and fair to the United States, and some increased independent capability of our allies. That actually complicates the disruptors strategy, and it in many ways has made the alliance healthier. And so I've seen those adjustments in person from those visits, the presidents, The Secretaries of Treasury and State were also very, very active in doing that. And frankly, I have never in my life seen any president and cabinet more actively engaged in the world than this administration has been in less than 1 year, to the point where there's now domestic blowback saying, will you please pay more attention at home? You're talking about peace in the world, but we want revival back in America, and that's, I think, where we are.
Matt, you want to weigh in. You can take it any way you want, but if you'll permit me just a preface. Do you think today that the language of Cold War is illuminating or obscuring when thinking about the state of play between the U.S. and China?
Yeah. Well, I'll cover that. I just wanted to clarify, and I'm sorry to see that I think Senator Wu is not here anymore, but I wanted to correct the record about the framing of the term Indo-Pacific, right? We heard this morning that essentially this is an American invention, right? I want to be very clear. This term was invented and essentially adopted 15 years ago, not by Washington, but by Tokyo, as an alternative to Beijing's Sino-centric Asia-Pacific framing that the entire region was a hub and spoke around Beijing, right? Shinzo Abe, particularly after the 2010-2011 series of embargoes by the Chinese and aggression in the Senkakus over China's efforts to be able to seize that territory from Japan, began to realize that fundamentally Japan faced a serious security and economic challenge from a country that was seeking to overturn an international system. And Japan created the concept of Indo-Pacific to be able to sort of broaden the narrative and broaden the frame in which we would view the region, so that we didn't just simply view this as China's region, but that there were multiple powers in the Indo-Pacific, right? And so to now hear folks lay out that the Indo-Pacific is a conspiracy of the United States to entrap Canada. First of all, France had an Indo-Pacific strategy before the United States published one. So I just want that to kind of be out there, because I think it's fundamentally we misunderstand these things, and we set ourselves up for really a set of talking points that we hear constantly in our interactions with Chinese officials about how these things are set up, and it's just disturbing to hear those same talking points presented back. In terms of language of Cold War, I think we should be wide-eyed that I think we all felt a degree of joy and happiness at the end of the first Cold War, right? That was something to be celebrated. That kind of international tension was sort of off the table, and that we could come to an agreement in which you would have global relations largely driven by sort of economic relationships, and those economic relationships would be fair and reciprocal, and that countries would avoid the use of military force to be able to seize new territory for themselves, and to change the map, and to expand their reach by annexing other countries, that was a worthy goal to have, right? And that was worthy for us to celebrate that. Unfortunately, we have found ourselves back in a situation in which we have major powers in the world, members of the UN Security Council, nuclear powers, who think that it is their right to claim territory that is independent and doesn't belong to them, and to be able to seize it and make it a part of their countries. Right? That's the world we're in now, and that requires a degree of deterrence and collective security, which is the same sort of thing that got us into the first Cold War. Right? We had an aggressive country that wanted to be able to sort of expand its reach and control, and a series of countries that wanted to protect their sovereignty and to be able to have their own ways of governance. They wanted to be able to protect those things, and they adopted collective security to be able to do that. And I think in many ways we find ourselves in a similar sort of aspect today. Right? The Cold War was about a long game of waiting out your adversaries. And I suspect that that's the same sort of thing that we're in now. We may adopt a different term, but unfortunately, the international situation looks very similar to the kinds of problems we face today.
I ask in part because in the old Cold War framework, the world was divided into these bipolar relationships, and you were kind of all in or not. And in the last session, there was talk of strategic autonomy.
Yeah.
That is Canada obviously maintaining close relationships with the United States, but also looking to enter into economic and security arrangements with other parts of the world, effectively hedging, if I can put it that way. Fred, talk a bit about the idea of strategic autonomy in the context that Matt has just described. How will not just this administration, but possibly future administrations think about countries like Canada seeking out a policy of strategic autonomy? Sure.
One before I know we now conceptualize the period from 1948 to 1991 as bipolar, but I think we also have to remember that it was multipolar, right? Countries pursued their own foreign policies. Willy Brandt in West Germany pursuing Ostpolitik, right? Japan pursuing its own relationships with Russia, right? Those things all happened within the context. There was a wide variety of foreign policies, right? A non-alignment movement that happened in the world. The world was not neatly divided into two halves, right? It was a messy, with a lot of hedging going on between countries, right? And so we shouldn't be surprised to say, well, it looks messy and multipolar today. It couldn't possibly be like that. Right? In fact, it was very much like that. And I think we have to remember those things.
So is that a permission structure, if I can use that phrase, for a country like Canada to be pursuing strategic autonomy, including possibly strengthening trade relationship with China, in spite of the American posture that we've just been discussing?
I mean, they don't need our permission. If that's what a country chooses to do, that's what a country chooses to do. There's just an awful lot of examples of that happening in the past.
Well, America values its allies and its alliances, and Trump values this too. You may not hear that from CNN and the New York Times, and you saw this with his strong relationship, the strong relationship he's bringing with the new Japanese prime minister, but also with the strong relationship with the South Korean president, who, as you know, is a liberal, and he displaced a president who is now facing trial, who American conservatives really like. But President Lee has pursued a pragmatic foreign policy and has struck a pretty good relationship with President Trump. And Trump has made it clear that he sees this partnership with Japan and South Korea as crucial to countering the threat from North Korea and China. And Canada is part of that as an Asia-Pacific state. I think an element of this that is sort of dominating the Trump administration's thinking towards Asia-Pacific security is talk of this axis between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And this is a product of the weakness of the Biden administration and the war in Ukraine. We now have North Korean soldiers in Ukraine. We have Russia and North Korea forging an alliance where Russia is providing satellite technology and I don't know what else to the North Koreans. We see Iran selling drones that are killing thousands of Ukrainians every week. We see a much stronger relationship, an economic relationship, political relationship between Russia and China. This Russia-China axis is extremely dangerous to global security. And as Canada reaches out to normalize relations with Russia, there had to be with China, there had to be some strings attached. China can't be supporting the war in Ukraine. Now, I'm optimistic, a little bit optimistic right now, that maybe Chinese energy firms are going to cooperate with Trump's new sanctions on Russian energy. I hope China does that, but I think it's important that we all say to the Chinese, this war is a threat to the global order, and China shouldn't be part of it. China wants to be a leading nation. It can't be hanging out with this rogue group. In fact, I understand China does not actually like this axis term because it doesn't like being lumped together with the Iranians and the North Koreans. I don't know if that's true. My friends in Japan tell me that. But I think that we have to have conditions as we improve relations to say to China, it's not just human rights, But as you're propping up the Russians as they destroy, and Ukraine will lose this war. If we don't end it, Ukraine is going to run out of troops. China's helping that. We shouldn't be helping China do this. It is a real threat to global security. It is a precedent that will lead to future violations of national borders and states taking territory by force. So we need Canada. We need Canada to speak out. And when dealing with the Chinese, Ukraine should be in every diplomatic discussion.
Yeah, Steve, Matt called it a long game. That is the changing posture of the U.S. vis-a-vis China. We have a lot of Canadian policymakers in the room, people who studies these issues. What does that mean for Canada? How should Canada be thinking about its different entry points into that new posture and the potential trade-offs it means for us?
Well, fundamentally, I see especially the Trump second term, but really the entire advent of Trump as a figure in American politics and leadership it's a transition period. It's an adjustment period. There would have been no Trump election in 2016 if the promise of globalism had worked, if there hadn't been enough disruption and dislocation within the American workforce, there wouldn't have been this different coalition that organized around Trump. And that coalition was not overwhelmingly ideological. It was largely lunch bucket labor people who had for decades voted Democrat, but they felt like they had been forgotten and left behind. And so this combination of populism or what have you can be kind of an organizing umbrella that explains the coalition and how it comes up. But ultimately what this is a force of adjustment and transition. It's a transition away from what I would argue was the era of globalism, which I think you could, the Cold War was a form of that, but the dream that it's the economy stupid and that's all, that was a form of globalism. It was also just a dream. And so we're in a period of adjustment. Some of those adjustments may endure, but one of those adjustments, and I think there'll be a lot of hedging and back and forth negotiations and all this, but one of these is that it's not really sustainable for economic security and national security strategies to be too far at odds. And if you look at the crippling tension that was within NATO, you had major NATO powers seeking economic advantage with Russia at the expense of America, and then expecting America to pay the overwhelming price to deter and to defeat the national security threat, not just to America, but to them. And so that's like a double rent. And that part just, I think, the bubble has burst. I don't think that will go back in terms of major American Democrat or Republican ways of looking at the world. Our alliances have to mean something to both sides, but it has to mean how are we organized economically and also militarily and in other ways. And if those are wildly out of balance, then you have a really at-risk and unhealthy alliance. So we've been through that in other areas. I would argue that our East Asia alliances were least at risk of this, but there was still room for gardening and improving, and we're going through that process. But there'll be some burps and tickles, and not everyone's going to be happy through the whole process, but I would see this as a transition. I don't think there is a definition of where the contours and institutions might be at the end. I don't think that we're going to have a world without alliances. I don't think we're going to have a world without coalitions of the willing. I, for one, think that one of the institutions that doesn't seem to exist right now, we have a G7, and there's a reason for a G7, but there's this center of gravity on technology, space, artificial intelligence, and the infrastructure and education necessary to support that needs to be dominated by responsible stakeholders who actually set standards that are going to be kept. And there's no institution to do things like that. But I think we're in a period of adjustment where is there going to be a G7 and a T7? Is there going to be? But what we know for a fact is it's not going to be the United Nations. The United Nations may continue, but the United Nations has a dog's breakfast of a record of going around and actually solving fundamental conflicts and security issues. That ends up being coalitions of the willing that end up doing something. If something's going to be done about the persecution, borderline genocide of Christians in Nigeria, it's not going to be because of the United Nations. It's going to be because of other coalitions capable of using economic, military, and other inducements and penalties to do so. And so I think we're in that transition period that can be frustrating and dispiriting, but you can also choose to see it, well, I've got the opportunity to put some things on the table to improve this deal in favor of what I think is an overlap in this Venn diagram, and maybe I should focus on seizing that ground for now until the game changes. After this administration comes and goes, we see where things settle, you make your informed decision then. But I don't think we're at a period where we're announcing what the next 50 years will look like. I think we're looking at what the contours of the current decade are looking like, and that's very much up for grabs.
You use the language of transition, use the language of adjustment. You use the phrase negotiate, but you weren't merely talking about bilateral, multilateral negotiation. You were talking about internal negotiation,
Yes.
negotiation within the American political system, and even negotiating within the American conservative movement as it works through what this means for American policy. I use the phrase, Matt, an incomplete project. Can you talk a bit about where some of those tensions or fault lines exist, even within the, again, lack of a better word, America First movement, particularly as it relates to the Indo-Pacific, but maybe more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not surprising that that a movement on the right, on the conservative side, is not monolithic, right? Folks have a variety of opinions on these things. There clearly isn't complete consensus within the administration, and there isn't complete consensus outside of it, right? You have some who are looking this primarily through the lens of sort of economic prosperity and domestic economic issues, right? And they will then approach it from a certain perspective. You have a set of folks who are looking at it from the perspective of national security and foreign policy, in which they have both, some who are deeply skeptical. They look back to sort of the forever war concept and the rejecting of America's sort of overextending itself out into the world, and wish to sort of retrench that back. You have others who say, yes, those things that happened around Afghanistan and Iraq certainly were overextensions, but the issues that we're dealing with today with both Moscow and Beijing are very different from those kinds of problems, right? And so trying to use solutions for Iraq and Afghanistan to be able to solve the problems that Beijing and Moscow pose to the international order is just sort of a wrong way to approach it, right? So you've got these various aspects that are playing out. In my opinion, it's unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but it's reality that it's the sort of the economic and trade side that are largely driving that discussion. In many ways, so sort of the foreign policy and national security side is a part of the discussion, but it's not the centerpiece of it. And that shouldn't be surprising because, invariably that's kind of what voters are most worried about. It's what they spend their time sort of thinking about. But that is gonna play out now over the next few years. And we'll see what things get sort of solidified when we go through our own leadership transitions between administrations, right? I think it's now been pretty clear. I remember sort of being in charge of the imposition of Section 301 tariffs on the PRC, and being assured that they would all go away within 4 to 6 months, right? Well, that was 8 years ago. Those things are still in place. They were carried over by the Biden administration, and very much those are now sort of I would say that those are the kinds of things that are now as a new consensus that the U.S. is going to play costs on the Chinese economy for access into the U.S. market, and that's likely to be the case going forward, and that's likely not to come off. I don't know what the other things are going to be as we make those transitions in 28 or in 32.
Well said.
Could I make
Yeah, just before you do, Fred, I'm gonna give each of you one last kick at the can here with an informed policy making and policy adjacent audience in the room. I'll start with you, Fred, and then maybe go to you, Steve, and end with Matt. What's the respond to what you're going to, but also what's the kind of final message that you want to leave people with?
I thought Matt's comments were great, but I wanted to point out something interesting of the second-term Trump America First approach when he decided to change his approach to the war in Ukraine, when he said he would send weapons to Ukraine and implement sanctions. His supporters were pretty upset. They said, this isn't what we voted for. This isn't America First. When Trump decided to bomb Iran, many American conservatives, including Tucker Carlson, were irate. They said, look, we voted for you to keep us out of wars. But this is a different second term. This is a different president who had 4 years to think about his first term. And his response to Carlson and others was, I came up with the concept of America First, and I decide what's in it. And there's two things that are in it that are important to the president. First of all, stopping the killing in Ukraine. He's been obsessed with this. He wants to stop the war, negotiate the details later. And he's brought the Europeans and Zelensky kicking and screaming to this position. I think it's the only way to end the war. We may have an armistice in Ukraine. I don't think we'll ever have a negotiated settlement beyond that. But that's been Trump's position, and he's just told his supporters, this is the way it's going to be, and most of them have supported him. On Iran, he said, we can't tolerate Iran getting a nuclear weapon. That's why he decided to bomb Iran. It surprised many of his supporters. It surprised me. I didn't think Trump would ever decide that. But he had 4 years to think about his first term, and his policies are more flexible and pragmatic than I think the major media is giving him credit. I think we've seen a second Trump term that has certainly been eventful, maybe somewhat tumultuous and controversial, but I think there's a lot of hope with where Trump is going. And but we're going to need to work with our friends and allies to address these global securities, and that certainly is going to mean a strong relationship with Canada. And I know Ambassador Hoekstra had all kinds of good things to say about his work with Prime Minister Carney and the Canadian government, and I'm sure we'll be partnering together to promote global security.
Steve, final reflections?
Thank you for time and attention and indulging what might be non-mainstream ways of thinking and talking based on what the content of your information environment is generally. To me, that is a intellectually honest exercise to engage in, and I certainly didn't come here to engage in the conversation assuming that we were going to win a room or walk away with MAGA hat-wearing people coming out and joining the next rally. At the same time, I hope that what we've been able to put on the table is enough food for thought to contemplate, well, the era that we live in now and the challenges that we face are not defined by one man in the White House or one man in Beijing. That there's a lot of the rest of the world, all of which has agency, and it really comes down to organization and pooling of resources. When it comes to that, though, there are some inescapable facts. We do share a tremendously long land border with you. We have a long history of interaction with you. Some rogue and disrespectful people in my family might wonder, is there really a country up there? But we actually had farmers in Idaho that looked to Canada as their #1 trade partner in competition with Mexico. And so there's a lot of people in the middle part of America who are a part of the coalition that voted for President Trump for this adjustment. And so I would say if we remember that America remains by far, not close, but by miles, the largest consumer-driven economy in the world, you will never balance or replace that by bandwagoning with an export-led economic partner. It's just simple math, and it's not about opinion. But there is within that still room to grow and develop. I think our energy future, there's still going to be a deep respect for the endowment that our countries have been blessed with. We have natural resources that not everywhere in the world is lucky enough to have. We want to be good stewards of that. And if you have a life anywhere close to a farm, you want that farm to be sustainable, and you want to take care of that soil so that it replenishes and it's there for the next harvest, not just this harvest. That's the ethos that we share. We will do that and be able to extract our own resources and fuel our own energy abundance, maybe be able to feed and fuel the world in ways that are truly responsible and prosperous. And we will do that not by counting carbons, but by being sensible and responsible in our ongoing relationship with each other. And that, I think, is an opportunity. And I think that both the United States and Canada are and will remain leading Asia-Pacific countries, whatever we call the region. But we do have a point in conversation where we should continue this kind of dialogue to recognize where are the areas of overlap where we can accentuate and grow, and where there's disagreement, let's dive deep into understand why, hopefully filtering out the personality distractions.
Matt, you're batting cleanup.
Yeah, and I'll be short. Well said by my colleagues. I really appreciate you guys having us out here. And I think it's incredibly important to be able to have these sort of open dialogues back and forth for us to share opinions, even if we don't necessarily agree on everything, at least hearing out what each other has to say. So thank you.
And let me just say, again, I think what a great and important service here that Carlo and the team at the New North American Initiative have provided by bringing three people who've been involved in some of these intellectual currents and their political implementation through administrations. And yeah, I hope people found it as interesting and as insightful as I did. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you found this conversation interesting, even if one didn't agree with everything you heard, as Carlos says, one of the projects that we're launching as part of the New North American Initiative is a podcast series that we'll launch in the new year, where we'll bring other voices from the world of American political ideas and political practitioners who are influencing this work in progress that we've talked about today. So stay tuned. Hopefully, it similarly, I think, helps to inform and shape Canadian policymaking, business leaders, and so on. Yes. From as you should just grab the microphone. Because we're in I think a moment of paradigmatic scramble. We'll have voices from across the political spectrum who are part of the conversation that we've just had here.
But the right's more interesting.